The critic. Why are we so interested in historians? The historians we love wrote about big history at a time when Britain mattered. Article by David Herman, July 14th, 2020. Since the mid-1990s, there has been a growing fascination with the lives of leading British historians. There have been biographies of A.J.P. Taylor, E.H. Carr, Hugh Trevor Roper, and in the last year alone of E.J. Hobsbawm, Lewis Namer, and J.H. Plumb. In addition, there have been 4 books of letters and journals by Hugh Trevor Roper, a book of letters from Richard Cobb and David Cott's Isaac and Isaiah about the fraught relationship between Isaac Duscher and Isaiah Berlin. As for Berlin, a historian of ideas as well as a philosopher, since the 1990s there has been a biography, 4 volumes of letters and a book, In Search of Isaiah Berlin, by his literary editor, Henry Hardy, about the transformation of countless essays and lectures into numerous books of essays. What explains this interest, and why now? Is this wave of excellent biographies, well researched and clearly written, a tribute to an influential generation of British historians? Or does it tell us something about our sense of nostalgia for times gone by? For historians, but also for the history they wrote. What is immediately striking is the group of historians at the center of these biographies. They were all in their heyday in the mid-20th century England. They were all born around the turn of the century. Apart from Namer, they published their major works from 1950s. J.H. Plumb's 5 major books on English long 18th century history, which made his name a historian, appeared between 1950 to 1960. E.H. Carr's 14-volume History of Soviet Russia was published between 1950 and 1978. Namer was knighted in 1952. A.J.P. Taylor published The Struggle for Mastery in Europe in 1848 to 1918 in 1954, and The Origins of the Second World War in 1961. Trevor Roper was appointed Regius Professor of Modern History at Oxford in 1957. E.H. Carr published What is History in 1961. E.J. Hobsbawm wrote The Age of Revolution, the first book in his 4-volume history of modern Europe in 1962, and Taylor published his English history in 1914-1945 in 1965. What is striking about these books and the many others produced by these historians is how many appeared in paperback. This was the first generation of British historians who wrote for a large, mainstream audience, students at the new 1960s universities, but also an educated readership formed by Rab Butler's 1944 Education Act. Taylor, Hobsbawm, and Plumb, in particular, wrote clear, accessible prose for this huge new audience. Carr's History of Soviet Russia and What is History were published by Penguin. Plumb's England in the 19th Century and Taylor's English History, 1914-1945, came out in Publican editions. Hobsbawm's Industry and Empire was published by Penguin, and his Tetralogy on Modern Europe came out in paperback. In his superbly researched biography of E.J. Hobsbawm, it is surely no coincidence that R.J. Evans calls the chapter on 1962-1967 Paperback Writer. Looking back on an earlier time, Hobsbawm later wrote, "That was a time when British academic historians would have been shocked to think of themselves as potential paperback writers, i.e. writers for broad public. Between the world wars, hardly any historians of standing did, other than G. M. Trevelyan. Many of them even shied away from writing books of any kind, hoping to make their reputations with learned articles in specialist journals. All this has changed. My own generation, especially those passionate expositors and popular educators, Marxists and other radicals, wrote eagerly, both for the academic specialists and the non-specialist public. Publishers, increasingly advised by academics, soon noticed that the learning public grew spectacularly as higher secondary and university education expanded, and the chasm between sixth form and college level disappeared. In the preface to The Age of Revolution, Hobsbawm writes that his ideal reader is that theoretical construct, the intelligent and educated citizen. In his biography of J.H. Plum, Neil McKendrick says Plum opened up a new world of popular history written for mass audiences. Plum, he says, was a writer who reached out to millions of readers. He pioneered the route to respectable popularization. These historians sold in huge numbers. These historians all had an astonishing range. Namer and Taylor wrote about acclaimed books about British and European history. Trevor Roper wrote about the European witch craze of 16th and 17th century and the Second World War, Archbishop Laud and Hitler's last days. Hobsbawm wrote about bandits and laborers, South America, and the fall of the Soviet Union. They didn't just write books. They wrote what one might call the higher journalism for The Observer and Sunday Times, Encounter, Spectator, and The New Statesman. Book reviews, but also thoughtful pieces on the politics of the day. Many were also popular broadcasters on the Third program and later Radio 4 and on BBC and ITV. Taylor was famous for his unscripted talks to camera. From 1955, he was a panelist on ITV's discussion program, Free Speech, where he remained until the series ended in 1961. In 1957 through 1958, and 1961, he made a number of half-hour programs on ITV in which he lectured without notes on a variety of topics such as the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the First World War. These were huge ratings successes. He also lectured for a BBC historian series in 1961 and made more series for it in 1963, 1976, 1977, and 1978, and hosted additional series for ITV in the 60s. Of course, left-wing historians like Christopher Hill, Isaac Dusher, and E.P. Thompson also reached a large audience, but there is another reason why recent biographies, apart from Hobsbawm, have not been about Marxists. The focus of many of these new biographies is on Oxbridge, mid-20th century Oxford in particular, the Oxford of Trevor Roper, A.J.P. Taylor, and Isaiah Berlin. It wasn't just Oxford that placed these historians in the establishment. Many had a good war, whether the First World War, Namer and Carr, or the Second, Trevor Roper and Berlin, in intelligence. But above all, they didn't just write history. They wrote big history about great events. The French and Russian revolutions, the two world wars, modern British history, from the 18th century to the 20th, the Industrial Revolution. Not dry academic monographs on small details. Namer and Plum reinvented 18th century English history. Namer and Taylor reinvented Europe between 1848 and 1918. Carr offered Penguin readers the standard account of the Russian Revolution. Taylor, the most readable account of Britain during both world wars. Hobsbawm, the standard account of Europe from 1789 to 1991. In the History of Ideas, Isaiah Berlin wrote about the Age of Enlightenment and the roots of Romanticism, 4 essays on liberty and freedom and its betrayal, Tolstoy and Karl Marx. They wrote prolifically and accessibly about the great subjects of modern British and European history. Many of these historians had lived through these times. Berlin had witnessed the Russian Revolution, met Akhmatova, Pasternak, and JFK. In Berlin in 1945, Trevor Roper was ordered to investigate the circumstances of Hitler's death. Louis Namur was an expert advisor to the Foreign Office during World War I. Significantly, they wrote about big history at a time when British history mattered. Britain had just won 2 world wars and had been a world power since the 18th century, building a great empire, had been the first country to have an agricultural and industrial revolution, and spoke of freedom, tolerance, and democracy in a century which had experienced dictators, genocide, and the rise of totalitarianism in Europe. This generation of historians created a new narrative about the British past. Plum and Namur rewrote the 18th century, Hobsbawm rewrote the 19th, and Taylor painted a vivid picture of the 20th century. It is no coincidence that many of these historians came from Middle England. A.J.P. Taylor was born in Birkdale in Lancashire. J.H. Plum was born in Leicester. Trevor Roper in Northumberland. All were products of Edwardian England, formed by a certain notion of Englishness. Even outsiders like Berlin from Riga and Namur from Galicia were lifelong Anglophiles, who came to Britain on either side of the First War. They knew the world of their readers in a way that historians no longer do. Many of today's leading British historians, Nigel Ferguson, Simon Schachma, Mark Moshauer, John Brewer, see Britain and Europe from America. Ferguson once described himself as Homo Atlanticus. It is a different world from Edwardian Birkdale, where Taylor grew up. Does British history matter as much today? Hobsbawm wrote Industry and Empire when Britain was still an industrial nation. It isn't now. A.J.P. Taylor ended his book English History, 1914 through 1945, with the famous words, "Few now sang, land of hope and glory. Few even sang, England arise. England has risen all the same." This optimism had more resonance in the swinging 60s, a time of rising affluence when Britain had just elected its first Labour government since Attlee, which British historians writing today could share that optimism now. J.H. Plum wrote popular biographies of Chatham and Walpole. Would any of these have a wide readership today? He mentions slavery just 4 times in his England in the 18th century, 1950. 70 years on that could not be published. The way we think about history, especially British history, has changed. This wave of biographies is not just about nostalgia for a bygone world of mid-20th century Oxford. It is also about a generation of big personalities, often embroiled in controversy, who could be seen on TV and read in the Sunday papers. But above all, they wrote about big history, at a time when Britain mattered. Perhaps that is what we miss most of all, and what these biographies remind us of. This article has been Why Are We So Interested in Historians? Written by David Herman, July 14th, 2020, and found in The Critic.